In this clip, we'll learn how to illuminate our scene using various types of Maya lights. Okay, so after you've gone through the shading process, but before you can render out a final image of your assets, you need to create lights that will illuminate them, creating things like highlights and shadows in your scene. Now, at first glance, you may look at our spacecraft here and think, well, there are lights in our scene. However, these lights that we see right now, you can see how these surfaces are illuminated and there looks to be shadow under here. These are actually a result of the default Maya lighting, which is really intended to adequately illuminate any of the objects that you're working on. However, when you're rendering, it's not going to render, so we need to create custom lights. Now, before we do that, let's come over here to the lighting menu and select this Use All Lights option. It's the 7 key on your keyboard. Now, when I do that, you'll notice here that the lights go out and we just see the silhouetted form that we're working with. Now, when I orbit around to the back, you do see the flame on the back side. However, that particular material has emissive qualities. That's why we're able to see that particular piece of geometry. So let's go ahead and create some lights here. There are a few different areas that we can create lights here inside of Maya. One would be the rendering shelf, and you can see several different shortcuts right here. Another would be under the Create menu if we go to the Lights submenu. I'm going to come in here and we're going to create a point light. Notice here that the icon next to the point light matches up with this one right here inside the shelf. We'll go ahead and drop that in. That's just a couple of the places that you can actually create a light. There are several more, but those are the two most common that I use. So now looking at the illumination we're seeing at this point, it's a little bit distorted, but that's because the point light was dropped right inside the cockpit of our spaceship. You can see the origin of our scene lives right inside the cockpit, so that's why we're getting a little bit distorted illumination. Let's go ahead and grab the Move tool here and move that light up and out in front, kind of right about there. Okay, great. So you can see we have an adequate amount of illumination coming from this small point, and it's emitting out of this point in all directions. This is the behavior for a point light, a single point in space casting light in all directions. Now, I want to, with this particular light selected, begin to introduce you to some of the attributes that you'll be working with when you're using Maya lights. Let's go ahead and come over to the attribute editor and take a look at a few of those. So the first thing you have here is the type. This is something that can be changed. If we wanted to use something besides a point light, we could just simply drop this down and select it. And there are all the default Maya lights here at the bottom, and then these AI lights. These are all Arnold lights or light utilities. So the color is the next attribute, and right now our light is emitting perfectly white light. That may be great for you, but if you wanted to create the illusion that maybe this particular spacecraft is in kind of a cool lighting scenario or even a warm lighting scenario, then you may want to change the color. And that's simple to do. It's just like changing the color inside of a material. We'll just come over and mix either a warm color or maybe we want sort of a cool color. Sort of like so. All right, great. Now the intensity is something that is going to control the strength of the light. And this is something you should be careful with. When you're starting to light your scenes here inside of Maya, you really want to be rendering them out as well to gauge the illumination that you're working with. Because in my experience, what we see here inside the viewport isn't always the best depiction of the amount of illumination that we're going to get in our renders. So you'll notice here that if I grab my Move tool and move this light further away from our spacecraft, the amount of illumination decreases. And when it's closer, the amount of illumination increases. So we can adjust the intensity simply by inputting a value here. Now, speaking about intensity and the way light is transferred from this particular light source to the faces on our mesh, the decay rate is something that's going to come into play here. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but this no decay option that is the default on this point light is not real-world lighting behavior. Real-world lights decay at a quadratic rate. You can drop this down and change it right here. Now, oftentimes the rendering engine you're using will have other ways of compensating for that no decay option. In the case of Arnold, there is actually a setting down here in this Arnold rollout that handles that for me. Now, I want to talk about these little check boxes here. The illuminate by default is simply going to turn the light on and off. Now, the emit diffuse and emit specular really go hand in hand because this controls the elements inside of our scene that are going to be illuminated by this light. So if we only wanted color information to be shown as a result of this light's only going to illuminate color information, then we would leave this emit diffuse checked. So if we uncheck the emit specular, you'll see here we're only getting color information, none of those specular areas. Now, it just so happens that the material I have created here for this ship is meant to mimic a metallic surface, so it largely relies on that specularity. We could come in here and see that by disabling the emit diffuse and enabling emit specular. And you can see a lot of that missing detail comes back. Okay, fantastic. So this is a point light. Now, before we talk any more about lights, I do want to say that this point light and the behavior of this light isn't 100% physically accurate because there is no area to this light. This light comes from a single point in space, and all lights in the real world have some kind of a physical area to them. They take up some amount of area. So let's go ahead and change this point light over to something like an area light. Now, when I do that initially, you'll notice here that the lights go out, but that's because our area light is very, very tiny here. I think that it would be worthwhile to watch as I slowly scale this light up, because I want you to see how the illumination changes based on the scale. When we start scaling up the size of our area light, you'll start to notice the amount of illumination increases, because that intensity or that illumination is tied directly to the scale of this light. Now, in looking at this, you can see that the light pattern coming from an area light is that light will emit in 180 degrees from the side that has this small little line growing out of it, right here. And you can see that reflected as the illumination pattern is cast on the ship underneath here. Now, angling and pointing an area light where you want it to go can be sort of challenging. Sure, you can grab your rotate tool and you can begin to try and sort of rotate this into position, and maybe then use your move tool to adjust here. But there's a much easier way to do this. You can actually come in with your lights selected and go to the panels menu of your viewport, and you can come over here and choose this look through selected option. Now, when I do that, the viewport looks to go kind of wonky, but you can just imagine that we're looking through a camera that's attached to that area light. So now when we navigate in the viewport, what we're actually doing is pulling back and positioning that area light. This, in my opinion, is the best way to position an area light when you're working with it. So we can come over here and we can kind of get that where we want it. We can come back to our panels menu, perspective, and go to our perspective camera. And there we go. You can see I've moved our area light. Okay, great. Now, just to close this particular clip out, I want to add a little context for you before we move on. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to reveal this BG display layer. And what you're going to see here is that this landscape shows up behind our ship. So my idea for this is that we're going to render out this ship flying through this canyon. Now, in the case of this particular scenario, an area light isn't the best light to emulate a large light source that's very far away, something like the sun. That particular light is a different light entirely inside of Maya. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to my attribute editor, and I'm going to change the type of light that I have selected here from an area light to a directional light. There we go, right there. Now, when we do that, the manipulator is going to change, and you can see here that the manipulator for the directional light looks like 4 arrows, and you can see those right here. Now, this light is great at emulating a very large light source that is very, very far away. And we can come in here and we can begin to just simply rotate this around and control the angle of the sun. just like so. All right, great. So in this video, we've learned how to create and use some of the basic light types that come with Maya.